Hi everybody, I'm Jim. Welcome back to the channel. I'm going to continue with the 10-year reading plan as we sort of hike our way through the great books, a grand tour of the great books of the Western world. We're in year 2. We're back into Aristotle, and we're reading his work on Poetics. It's a short treatise of literary criticism. It's really the first work of literary criticism in ancient literature that I can think of. There might be something before it, but Aristotle is certainly one of the founders of that genre. Aristotle, this is in volume 2, right at the end, the very last work. So let's talk a little bit about On Poetics. This is a really foundational work of literary theory. And I'll walk you through the table of contents just to give you a survey of what he's talking about in here. You can probably read this book in one sitting, 1 to 2 sittings. This was a reread for me, and I've really enjoyed it. Anyway, the first section is about the preliminary discourse on tragedy, epic poetry, and comedy as the chief forms of imitative poetry. So there's 3 kinds of poetry, basically: tragedy, epic poetry, and comedy. And then he goes into details. There's some chapters about that. And then the second major part is a definition of tragedy and the rules for its construction. So he goes deeper into tragedy. He's using tragedians like Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, some of whom we've read in this year 2 of the plans. Sophocles and Aeschylus come to mind. And he's using them as models. So he's filling this treatise with lots of examples from familiar poets and unfamiliar ones. Probably some of these people he's referring to, like, their work hasn't survived or only in fragmentary terms, and then other stuff has fared better. Anyway, definition of tragedy, the rules for its construction. He talks a lot about plot. He talks about unity of action. He talks about how a poet must depict the probable and the universal. He talks about simple and complex plots. He talks about these plot concepts such as peripety, discovery, and suffering. Peripety is sort of that turning point in the action. Discovery, you learn new knowledge. Suffering goes along with tragedy. And so he gets into that. He also talks about how the plot can best produce the emotional effect of tragedy. He talks about tragic heroes, the tragic deed. There's a little bit of misperception about the tragic flaw. He does talk about that, but that's often misunderstood. It's really an error that the tragic hero makes. Something in their character leads to them heading in the wrong direction. He talks about characterization, the rules for character of tragic personages. He then appends some more discussion on plot in this section, talking about the different forms of discovery, additional rules for the construction of a play, and diction of tragedy. There's a little bit of like linguistics and figurative language is talked about here. He talks about like the thought of a poet, like that's a major component. And finally, he has a rather shorter section on the rules for the construction of an epic. He has many interesting things to say about epic, comparing it to tragedy. I wish he went on longer with it, but talks about unity of action. He talks about points of resemblance between epic poetry and tragedy, but he also draws distinctions, possible criticisms of epic or tragedy and the answers to them, and how tragedy is artistically superior to epic poetry. Although we should mention that he has high praise for Homer as the master of epic poetry, and Homer is used a lot for examples here. That's like just a general descriptive table of contents for the work. My takeaways from this work are it's essential literary criticism, literary theory. Like anyone who's studying literature really needs to familiarize themselves with this work. Even if you have a casual interest in it, it's worthwhile, because we all watch drama. We all, go see films and plays. We read novels. We may not all read epic poetry anymore, but like epic poetry kind of survives in other forms of long fiction, like the novella and the novel. And these concepts that he's come up with about plot, about thought or theme, about character, we're still using these concepts. They really still work. I'm not saying that's the last word on any of that, but it really is fundamental. Also, if you are a creative writer and you fancy yourself a novelist, a dramatist, you write screenplays, you gotta learn Aristotle on poetics. It's just so important, these concepts. With that in mind, let me ask a few discussion questions, which you're welcome to comment on, or if you're in a book group, you can use these as fuel for conversation. I want to talk about a concept that Aristotle comes up with called catharsis. And he talks about how the ultimate purpose of a tragedy is to arouse the emotions of pity and fear. And what happens when those emotions are aroused is the audience experiences catharsis, which is a purgation or a clarification of these emotions. They come into your consciousness, they well up, they overpower you, and you understand them better, but you also are kind of purged or cleansed of these feelings of pity and fear after experiencing a good tragedy. It's a form of psychological release. Now, the question is, I have a few questions about this. Is this psychological release that is catharsis, is it a healthy social function? Does it serve a social purpose? How does this concept apply to media, film, literature that we consume today? Does the best of modern literature and film continue to deliver cathartic effects? Does it fall short? Do we not do this as much as the ancient Greeks did? And if you do feel like there's examples of catharsis in modern literature and film, what examples would you come up with? Works that really overpowered you and where you felt purged afterwards. If you don't think this is happening so much anymore, you might conjecture why not. And what are the implications of a literature that doesn't arouse pity and fear? It does not purge the emotions anymore. Have you analyzed this at all? It's kind of fun to think about. Now, I should have mentioned these other sort of components of story that he spends a lot of time talking about. I mentioned plot already. That's a big one for Aristotle. And he has so many interesting things to say about plot, action, incident. But there's plot, there's character, there's thought, there's diction, and then there's spectacle. He talks about all five of those. And you might think about which of those components is most important in generating the effect known as catharsis. The two components he talks the most about on Poetics are plot and character. You might pit them against one another, and he claims that plot, the word mythos relates to plot, story, fable. The plot is the soul of a tragedy, and it's more important than character or ethos. It's not saying character is not important, but he seems to lean more heavily towards plot as being the linchpin of it. Do you agree with that? Like, do you agree that sort of would you put plot higher on the hierarchy than character? And then this leads to some literary aesthetic questions. Again, we maybe think of what as a writer might think. Can a truly great literary work get by on brilliant character depth if the narrative structure is weak? Or is a meticulously crafted plot, a very well-told story, always the foundation of good narrative art or great narrative art? Can a truly great literary work get by solely on a well-crafted plot without great characters? I think of having been through creative writing classes myself and having taught some creative writing, the modern discourse in creative writing talks a lot about character-driven fiction and novels that are primarily character-driven fiction. But we also have plenty of examples of plot-driven storytelling. Very important in filmmaking, but it's also very, very important in a lot of genre fiction. In literary fiction, it seems like then we start moving more towards character-based storytelling. I'm talking in generalities here, but hopefully you're familiar with some of that discourse. That's what these questions are getting at: the plot versus character, which is more important to you in terms of a reader, as a reader, as an audience member. And I think, a middle ground approach is probably the way to go here, where you really need both. Like in a play like Oedipus the King, Oedipus is a great character. It's also a supremely well-told story. Like the plot is interlocked. It's like a fine watch, well-made watch. It's just like clockwork. It's how brilliantly Sophocles put that story together. Aristotle has plenty of really nice things to say about that in this work. And finally, he talks a few places in the Poetics about fiction and history, or poetry and history. He states that poetry is more philosophical and higher than history because poetry speaks of universals, what might happen, while history speaks of particulars, what did happen. And how does this, first of all, you may or may not agree with that, but second of all, how does this change the way we view the truth of fiction? The word fiction, colloquially, we say something's a fiction, it's made up. And something that's made up does a lot of lying or is fabricated. How can that tell the truth? Why might a manufactured, a constructed story reveal more about the human condition than history, than a factual account, than any kind of nonfiction? Do you think fiction is truly capable of speaking these great truths? I know where I stand on that. My answer is yes. But to truly answer that, you have to get into explaining why. Like, why is that the case? I'll leave that for you to discuss in the comments. It should be a fun discussion. I think On Poetics is one of Aristotle's most accessible works. It really has a lot of resonance to this day. People are still using it practically for writing advice and guidance and for, establishing standards of literary artistic excellence. Like it's a really brilliant work. And with that, we're going to move on to the next stage in the reading journey. And we're going to stay with Aristotle for the next stop. And we're going to read selections from his very famous work of ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics. We'll read book 2, book 3, chapters 5 through 12, and book 6, chapters 8 through 13. I peeked ahead and looked at those. It's not a tremendous amount of reading. It can be done probably in about 2 or 3 days, depending on your pace. But you'll get a nice taste of what Aristotle has to say about virtue and about ethics. Anyway, I'm looking forward to talking about that with you next time on this series. Remember, we have a playlist, so if you want to watch all the previous talks about the readings in year 1 and year 2, just go to the playlist and get caught up. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Don't be afraid of Poetics. It's a pretty easy read, except for those chapters on diction, which isn't much. That gets a little bit in the weeds, and he's introducing a lot of like Greek words that may be unfamiliar to you. That aside, it's a very, very, very accessible work of literary theory. And you probably, when you were in your English class in high school and college, you probably came across a lot of these concepts that he talks about in this work. It's that famous. Anyway, I enjoyed talking about that with you. Be well. We'll see you again next time. Bye.